It was a day like any other in the bustling city of Westbrook. The noise of traffic filled the air, and the streets were alive with people going about their daily routines. In the middle of this rush, 28-year-old Daniel sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the rejection letter in his hands. It was the third one this month. For 5 years, Daniel had poured everything he had into his dream of starting his own tech company, but nothing seemed to work. The words on the letter blurred as frustration welled up inside him. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the weight of all his past failures. Every business proposal, every pitch meeting, every sleepless night spent coding, designing, and dreaming felt like it had led to this moment. Another closed door. Another reminder that, despite all his efforts, he still hadn't made it. This can't be how my story ends, Daniel muttered under his breath. He had always been a fighter, someone who believed that hard work could solve anything. But lately, it felt like life was determined to knock him down, one setback after another. Feeling defeated, Daniel grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, hoping a walk would clear his mind. As he strolled through the city, his thoughts spiraled. He had invested so much of himself in his company. He had quit a stable job, taken out loans, and sacrificed time with friends and family, all in the belief that his idea would change the world. But now, all he had to show for it was a mountain of debt and a string of failures. As Daniel walked, lost in thought, he found himself at the city park. It was quieter here, away from the noise and chaos. He sat down on a bench and stared at the empty playground in front of him. That's when he noticed an older man sitting at the other end of the bench, quietly observing him. "You look like you've been through the ringer," the man said, his voice gentle but knowing. Daniel hadn't even noticed him until he spoke, but something about his calm demeanor made Daniel open up. "Yeah, you could say that," Daniel sighed. "I've been trying to build my own company for years, but it feels like every time I get close, something goes wrong. It's like I'm taking one step forward and 3 steps back." The old man nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood exactly what Daniel was going through. "You know," the man said, "I've seen a lot of people fall down in life. Some never get back up, but others, they turn their greatest failures into their greatest comebacks." Daniel frowned. "Comebacks? It feels like I'm just stuck in a cycle of setbacks." The old man smiled faintly. "Setbacks are just part of the journey. They're not the end of the road, unless you let them be. Every setback holds a lesson. Every failure is a stepping stone, if you know how to use it. The difference between those who rise and those who stay down isn't luck or talent. It's resilience." Daniel considered the man's words, but felt a wave of doubt wash over him. "I don't know. I've been at this for years. How do you come back from failure after failure?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Daniel without explanation. Daniel unfolded the paper and read the words written on it. "It's not the fall that defines you. It's how you rise after." "What's this?" Daniel asked, puzzled. "Something I learned a long time ago," the man replied, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "You see, years ago, I was in your exact shoes. I lost everything, my job, my savings, my confidence. But I realized that life wasn't testing me to break me. It was testing me to see how far I was willing to go. It wasn't until I embraced my failures that I started to see them as opportunities." Daniel stared at the paper, letting the man's words sink in. Opportunities? Was it possible that the setbacks he had been facing were actually lessons in disguise? The old man stood up, ready to leave. "You're not at the end, son. This is just the beginning of your comeback. The question is, are you ready to rise?" Before Daniel could say another word, the man walked away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He sat there for a long time, staring at the words on the paper. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his failures weren't the end of his journey but the beginning of something new. As the sun began to set, Daniel rose from the bench, a new determination in his heart. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let his setbacks define him. He would rise, he would fight, and he would turn his failures into the foundation of his greatest comeback. The days following Daniel's conversation with the old man were a blur. The spark of hope had been lit inside him, but now came the hard part, figuring out how to move forward. He wasn't naive. He knew that simply feeling inspired wouldn't solve his problems. His debts were real, and the world didn't stop spinning because he had a moment of clarity. He needed a plan and fast. Daniel spent hours pacing in his apartment, notebook in hand, scribbling ideas only to cross them out minutes later. His once bright vision of success had been dulled by countless failures, and the fear of falling short again haunted him. But there was something different this time. Every time doubt crept in, he heard the old man's voice in his mind. It's not the fall that defines you. It's how you rise after. Finally, after what felt like an endless cycle of brainstorming and second-guessing, Daniel decided he needed a complete reset. The business model he'd clung to for so long wasn't working, and neither was his approach. It was time to strip everything back to the basics. He sat down at his cluttered kitchen table and took out a fresh sheet of paper. "What went wrong?" he wrote at the top, staring at the blank space below the question. The truth was hard to face, but he knew if he wanted to turn his setbacks into comebacks, he had to start by acknowledging his mistakes. For the next few hours, Daniel did just that. He reviewed every decision he'd made over the last 5 years. The failed pitches, the partnerships that went south, the product launches that flopped. It was brutal, but with each failure he wrote down, he began to see patterns. He realized he had been so focused on getting to the finish line that he'd ignored crucial steps along the way. His company wasn't failing because his idea was bad. It was failing because he had never fully laid the groundwork. It wasn't just about innovation, it was about execution. By the time Daniel finished his self-assessment, the weight of his past failures no longer felt as heavy. Instead of seeing them as defeats, he began to recognize them as lessons he had been too proud to learn before. Now, with fresh eyes, he was ready to rebuild, piece by piece. The next morning, Daniel set out with a new plan. He started small, reaching out to local business owners and entrepreneurs who had once expressed interest in his idea but had turned him down. This time, he wasn't pitching the grand vision of a world-changing app. He was asking for advice, for feedback on where he went wrong. At first, it was humbling. Some of the people he contacted didn't even remember him. Others politely told him they had moved on to other projects. But there were a few, just a few, who agreed to meet. And those meetings changed everything. One of the first people he met with was a woman named Sarah, a successful startup founder who had built and sold 2 companies. Daniel had pitched to her years ago, and she had rejected his idea, calling it too ambitious for someone without experience. Her bluntness had stung back then, but now he was ready to listen. "I remember you," Sarah said when they met at a small cafe downtown. "You had a big idea, but you weren't ready to execute it. What's changed?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I failed. A lot. But now, I want to know why. I want to understand where I went wrong and how I can fix it. I'm not looking for a second chance. I'm looking to do things right this time." Sarah smiled, impressed by his honesty. "That's a good start. But turning a setback into a comeback isn't just about learning from your mistakes. It's about changing your mindset. You have to stop seeing failure as a reflection of your ability and start seeing it as part of the process. The most successful entrepreneurs I know failed more times than they succeeded. The difference is they kept going." Over the next few weeks, Daniel met with more mentors, advisors, and even a few former competitors. Each conversation revealed something new, not just about his business, but about himself. He realized that his biggest obstacle had never been his ideas or his circumstances. It had been his own fear of failure. He had spent years avoiding risks, thinking that success meant never falling. But now, he understood that falling was part of the journey, and rising was what defined him. With this newfound clarity, Daniel went back to the drawing board. He reworked his business model from the ground up, focusing on solving smaller, more immediate problems for local businesses instead of trying to launch a massive, world-changing app right out of the gate. He streamlined his operations, cutting out the distractions and unnecessary features that had once bogged him down. It wasn't long before things started to change. One of the local business owners he had reached out to took a chance on him, offering him a small contract to develop a custom solution for their business. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the kind of project Daniel had envisioned when he first started his company. But it was a start, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the momentum shift. That one small contract led to another, and then another. With each success, no matter how small, Daniel's confidence grew. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but for the first time, he was building something solid, something real. And most importantly, he was doing it with the knowledge that setbacks were no longer something to fear. They were just steps on the path to his comeback. As Daniel sat at his desk late one night, looking at the progress he had made, he realized something profound. His greatest failure wasn't falling. It was the fear that kept him from getting back up. Now, he had learned to rise, and in that, he found his true power. Despite the momentum Daniel had begun to build, the road ahead was still full of obstacles. Though he had started landing contracts and gaining traction with his new business model, the reality of running a business was far more grueling than he had anticipated. The early wins felt like drops in the ocean compared to the mountain of challenges that remained. One late afternoon, Daniel sat at his desk in the tiny home office he had pieced together, staring at his laptop. He was working on a proposal for a new client, but his mind was elsewhere. His phone buzzed with notifications, emails from creditors, reminders about overdue payments, and a text from his landlord asking about rent. The small victories he had achieved so far had barely made a dent in his financial troubles. The weight of his debt, both personal and professional, felt suffocating. A sinking feeling gnawed at Daniel's stomach. His savings had dried up, and his credit cards were maxed out. He had pushed his personal relationships to the limit, borrowing money from friends and family who were beginning to lose faith in his dream. His parents, once supportive, had gently suggested he move on and find a stable job. And for the first time in months, Daniel found himself wondering if they were right. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah, the mentor who had given him advice early on in his comeback journey. They had kept in touch, and she had become somewhat of a guiding voice during his toughest moments. "Hey, Daniel." Sarah's voice came through the speaker. "I want to check in. How are things going?" Daniel paused, debating whether to put on a brave face or tell her the truth. After a moment, he sighed heavily. "Honestly, I feel like I'm drowning. I've made some progress, but it's nowhere near enough. The debts, the bills, they're piling up. I don't know how much longer I can keep this going." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Sarah spoke. "I understand. This is the part of the journey most people don't talk about, the breaking point." Daniel frowned. "The breaking point?" "Yes," Sarah said. "It's the moment where everything feels impossible, and you're standing on the edge, wondering if it's all worth it. Every entrepreneur, every person trying to make a comeback, reaches this point. It's where most give up." The words hung in the air. Daniel felt like Sarah had read his mind. He had never been this close to throwing in the towel. "What did you do when you hit your breaking point?" Daniel asked quietly, unsure if he wanted to hear the answer. "I pushed through," Sarah replied, "but not blindly. I took a step back and made some hard decisions. Sometimes you need to recalibrate. Ask yourself, am I doing this the right way? Is there another approach I haven't tried?" But the most important thing is to remind yourself why you started in the first place. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Why had he started? The excitement of building something new had long since been overshadowed by the grind of survival. He had forgotten the passion that had driven him in the first place, the desire to create a company that could solve real problems and make a difference. Somewhere along the line, that dream had been lost in the noise of overdue bills and looming deadlines. I don't know if I have it in me to keep going," Daniel admitted. Every time I feel like I'm getting ahead, something else knocks me down. Setbacks are inevitable, Daniel, Sarah said gently. But comebacks aren't about never facing challenges. They're about what you do when you face them. You've already gotten back up once. You can do it again, but only if you remember what you're fighting for. After the call, Daniel sat in silence for a long time, contemplating Sarah's words. He was at the breaking point, no doubt about it. But now, instead of seeing it as a dead end, he saw it as a crossroads. He could quit, like so many others had done when they reached this stage. Or he could do what Sarah had said, recalibrate, reassess, and push through with a renewed sense of purpose. That night, Daniel did something he hadn't done in months. He pulled out a journal and began writing. At first, the words came slowly, but soon they flowed. He wrote about why he had started his business in the first place, about the passion that had once burned so brightly within him. He wrote about the dreams he had of helping small businesses thrive, of creating technology that could make people's lives easier. As he wrote, he felt the weight of doubt slowly lift. In the days that followed, Daniel took a hard look at his business. He made the difficult decision to let go of a few side projects that weren't yielding results. He scaled back his operations even further, focusing on his core services and cutting unnecessary costs. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One morning, as Daniel was working on yet another proposal, his phone buzzed. It was an email from a mid-sized company he had pitched 2 weeks ago, one that he thought had forgotten about him. His heart raced as he opened the email. "Daniel, after reviewing your proposal, we believe your services would be a good fit for our upcoming project. We'd like to move forward with a contract." A wave of relief and excitement washed over him. It wasn't a huge deal, but it was a step in the right direction. And more importantly, it was proof that his efforts were paying off. As he signed the contract and sent it back, Daniel realized something. The breaking point wasn't a place to fear. It was a place to rebuild, to realign with your purpose. The breaking point was where comebacks were born. Daniel wasn't out of the woods yet. There would be more challenges ahead, more setbacks. But now, he knew how to face them, with resilience, clarity, and the unshakable belief that no matter how many times he fell, he had the strength to rise again. The contract with a mid-sized company gave Daniel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't just the financial boost that came with it, though that was desperately needed. It was the validation. For months, he had been fighting against the tide, trying to stay afloat in a sea of self-doubt. But now he had proof that all his hard work, sacrifice, and resilience were finally starting to pay off. Still, Daniel knew better than to let his guard down. Success in business wasn't just about landing one deal. It was about maintaining momentum, staying sharp, and constantly improving. He had made it past his breaking point, but there was no time to get comfortable. If anything, the stakes had risen. The days that followed were intense. Daniel threw himself into his work, determined not to let this opportunity slip away. He spent long nights refining the product, ensuring that every detail of the project for the new client was flawless. His experience with setbacks had taught him to be meticulous, to anticipate problems before they arose, and to always have a backup plan. He couldn't afford to fail, not now. As the project progressed, Daniel found himself not only meeting the client's expectations, but exceeding them. His passion was reignited, and it showed in his work. The client, impressed by his dedication and attention to detail, began referring him to other companies. One referral led to another, and soon Daniel found himself with more work than he could handle alone. That's when the next challenge arose: growth. With more clients knocking on his door, Daniel realized he couldn't do everything on his own anymore. His one-man operation was no longer sustainable. If he wanted to keep up with the increasing demand, he needed to expand. But hiring a team was a big step, and it came with risks. The last time he had tried to scale his business, things had spiraled out of control. He had taken on too much too fast, leading to many of the failures that had nearly driven him to quit. This time, Daniel vowed to do things differently. He wasn't just going to hire for the sake of hiring. He needed the right people. People who believed in his vision, who were committed to excellence, and who were willing to grow with the company. After weeks of interviews, Daniel assembled a small but talented team. There was Alicia, a sharp and creative marketing strategist who had left a corporate job in search of something more meaningful. James, a developer who had been freelancing for years, but was looking for a stable project to sink his teeth into. And Sophie, an operations manager with a knack for efficiency and streamlining processes. Together, they began to build what Daniel had always dreamed of, a company that wasn't just about profits, but about solving real problems for real people. The energy in the office was electric. Ideas flowed freely. And for the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had a team that believed in him and the comeback he was making. But with growth came new problems, and soon, Daniel was faced with one of the biggest challenges yet. One of their major clients, a client that accounted for nearly 40% of their revenue, announced that they were going through budget cuts and would have to scale back their contract with Daniel's company. The news hit hard. "We can't lose them," Alicia said during an emergency meeting. "They're our biggest client. If they pull out, it's going to hurt us big time." "I know," Daniel replied, his mind racing. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and the thought of losing such a significant client felt like a punch to the gut. But instead of panicking, Daniel took a deep breath. He had been through worse. After all, this was just another setback. And by now, he knew what setbacks really were: opportunities in disguise. "We're not going to lose them," Daniel said, determination setting in. "We're going to show them why we're worth every penny." That night, Daniel stayed late at the office, brainstorming solutions. How could they offer more value? How could they convince the client to stick around despite their budget constraints? His mind raced with ideas until he finally hit upon a strategy. Instead of focusing on what they might lose, he decided to focus on what they could gain. They would streamline the client's current services, offer more targeted solutions, and prove that, even with a reduced budget, his company could deliver exceptional results. The next day, Daniel and his team presented the new plan to the client. They didn't beg to keep the contract. Instead, they demonstrated how the new strategy could save the client money while increasing their overall impact. It was a bold move, one that required confidence and belief in their value. And it worked. The client not only agreed to maintain their contract, but also extended it into new areas of their business. Daniel's gamble had paid off, and his company emerged stronger from the crisis. As the months passed, Daniel's company continued to grow. They weren't a startup struggling to survive anymore. They were a thriving business, expanding their reach and impact. Daniel had gone from nearly losing everything to building something that mattered, something that could weather the storms that inevitably came with running a business. But the most important transformation hadn't been in the company. It had been in Daniel himself. He had learned that setbacks were not the enemy. They were part of the journey. Each fall had taught him something valuable, and each rise had made him stronger. The doubt that had once paralyzed him was now a distant memory, replaced by the quiet confidence that no matter what challenges came his way, he had the resilience to overcome them. One evening, after a long day at the office, Daniel sat alone at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He picked up the small piece of paper the old man had given him so long ago, now worn and creased from being carried in his wallet. He unfolded it and read the words once more. "It's not the fall that defines you, it's how you rise after." Daniel smiled. The old man had been right all along. The falls had been painful, but they had been necessary. They had shaped him, forged him into the person he was now. Someone who could turn setbacks into comebacks, over and over again. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the city as Daniel stood by the window of his office, looking out at the bustling world below. The company had grown beyond his wildest dreams. What had started as a desperate attempt to salvage his career had turned into something much more, a thriving business, built not on luck, but on perseverance and resilience. But today was different. Today, Daniel wasn't thinking about profits clients, or the next big project. Today, he was reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The last few years had been a roller coaster of highs and lows, of victories and setbacks. And while the highs felt incredible, Daniel knew that it was the lows, the failures, the moments of doubt, the breaking points that had truly shaped him. They had given him strength and wisdom that no amount of success could ever teach. As he reflected, Daniel thought about the people who had been part of his journey, his team, who had believed in him when his vision was just a faint hope, his mentors like Sarah, who had guided him through the toughest times, and of course, the old man who had planted the seed of wisdom in Daniel's heart with those simple words. It's not the fall that defines you, it's how you rise after. It was time to give back. A knock on the door broke his reverie, and Sophie, his operations manager, poked her head into the room. "You ready?" she asked with a smile. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." He grabbed his jacket and followed her down the hall to the conference room where a group of young entrepreneurs was waiting. Today, Daniel was the guest speaker at a startup accelerator program, sharing his story with people who were at the very beginning of their journey, the same place he had been not so long ago. As he entered the room, he saw the eager faces of the participants. Some were excited, others nervous. He could tell that many of them were struggling, unsure if their dreams were even possible. He knew that feeling well. Daniel stood at the front of the room and began to speak. "I'm here to talk to you about something you're all going to experience on your journey. Setbacks. They're inevitable. They're part of the process. But I want you to know that setbacks don't mean you failed. They're opportunities, hidden in the form of obstacles. And your ability to turn those setbacks into comebacks is what will determine your success." The room was quiet, the air thick with anticipation, as Daniel shared the story of his own journey. He spoke openly about his failures, the times he had been on the brink of giving up, the moments of doubt that had almost consumed him. He told them about the breaking point and how he had learned that true strength wasn't about avoiding failure, but about rising stronger each time he fell. "I want you to know," he said, "that there will be times when you feel like everything is falling apart, when the challenges seem too big and the dream too far away. But in those moments, I want you to remember something. Your greatest growth will come from your greatest challenges. The setbacks you face are the training ground for your comeback." He paused, scanning the room. Each of you has something incredible inside of you, a vision, a dream, a passion. But none of that will come to life if you let setbacks define you. It's not the fall that matters. It's how you rise after. A few people in the audience were taking notes, others nodding, and some sat with a contemplative look in their eyes, processing his words. Daniel saw himself in their faces, the uncertainty, the flickering flame of hope, the desire to succeed despite the odds. One young man in the front row raised his hand. "How do you keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart? How do you push through the doubt?" Daniel smiled. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? For me, it was remembering why I started in the first place. When I was at my lowest point, I had to go back to the basics. I had to remind myself why I was doing what I was doing. My passion, my vision, that was the fuel that kept me going. And then I had to trust the process. Success doesn't happen overnight. It's a series of steps, and sometimes those steps feel like they're taking you backward. But if you keep moving, keep learning, and keep getting back up, you'll find yourself further ahead than you ever imagined." The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. Daniel continued. "Another thing I've learned is to surround yourself with people who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. I had mentors and friends who pushed me when I wanted to quit. And eventually, I realized that failure isn't the end of the road. It's just a detour. It's part of the journey, and it's what shapes you into someone who can handle success when it comes." The rest of the session went by quickly, with Daniel answering questions, offering advice, and sharing insights he had gained through years of hard-earned experience. As the event came to a close, several of the participants approached him, thanking him for his honesty and encouragement. He could see the spark in their eyes, the same spark that had been reignited in him after hitting rock bottom. As Daniel left the room, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just because he had built a successful business, but because he had learned what true success meant. It wasn't just about financial gains or accolades. True success was about resilience, about turning failures into stepping stones, and using your experiences to lift others up. Walking out of the building, Daniel felt the cool evening air on his face. He smiled, thinking back to that day in the park when the old man had given him that simple piece of wisdom. Those words had saved him when he thought he had nothing left. Now, he was passing them on to the next generation of dreamers and doers, hoping they too would rise after their falls. As Daniel made his way to his car, he realized that this sharing his story, helping others, was his new legacy. It wasn't just about making a comeback anymore. It was about inspiring others to do the same. And in that, Daniel found his true purpose. Thanks for watching. If Daniel's story inspired you, remember, you're not defined by your setbacks, but by how you rise after each one. Every challenge is an opportunity in disguise, and your comeback is just around the corner. If you found value in this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who needs a boost, and subscribe for more motivational stories. Together, let's turn every fall into a stepping stone toward success. Stay strong, stay resilient, and as always, keep rising.